In this Genshin Impact guide, I'm gonna tell you everything about Skirk in a simple to understand step-by-step way. We go over her kit, how to play her, artifacts, builds, team options, and much more. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Now, the first things right off the bat, Skirk is a cryo sword user. She's an on-field DPS, but can also be played in a more quick swappy role. We're gonna get into that in just a minute. Before that though, let's go over her kit. And because Skirk is not that straightforward, and she has two very different main playstyles, the on-field and the quick swap one, we're gonna go over her kit today in a bit of a different order, so that way it's much easier to understand. Just bear with me for a minute and you're gonna see what I mean. Before we get into her skills, the first thing we need to talk about is her first Ascension passive, because what this does is, whenever a team member triggers a cryo reaction, this will create an item on the field called Void Rift, you can see it right there, and these Void Rifts are very important to Skirk's kit because they are what she uses to replenish the energy meter for her burst. Yes, that's true, Skirk does not work with normal energy, she can't use that at all in fact. Instead, she has a special energy resource called Serpent Sublimity Points, and those can only be refilled by consuming the Void Rifts that you put on the field with those cryo reactions. So, long story short, with Skirk, you want to make sure that you have a team that can trigger a lot of them, primarily though freeze reactions. Alright, so now that we know how her energy economy works with the Void Rifts, let's look into her first playstyle, that being the more standard on-field normal attack one. What you do in this one is, you trigger your elemental skill, which will give you more damage on your normal attacks and also infuse them with cryo. Once you press the skill, you will instantly get 45 of your burst energy points, and they will gradually go down over time while you're in this cryo-infused skill state. Now, all in all, this seems relatively straightforward, but there are a couple tricks that you can use to extend the duration of this state. First of all, because the duration is based on your burst energy points, you can consume Void Rifts, what we talked about earlier, to refill them while you're in this state. You can either do that with a charged attack, that will then consume Void Rifts near you, or you can unleash your burst while you're in your skill state. This will also consume the Void Rifts and on top, make your attacks even stronger for a little bit. And as always, if you could maybe give a little like to the video, that would refill my energy because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But alright, so much for the standard normal attack playstyle. Let's now go over the second playstyle, that being the Burst Quick Swap DPS, and this one is quite interesting. First of all, one thing you have to know is that her burst works very differently depending on whether you use it while you're in your skill state, what we talked about earlier, or if you use it when you're not in the skill state. That is what we're getting into right now. To deal massive front-loaded burst damage, you want to make sure to not be in your skill state, but instead cast your burst right away. This will then deal a huge amount of damage in multiple instances, kinda similar to Alhaitham's burst, and in order to cast it, you need 50 points of your special burst energy. However, if you have even more, then the damage of the burst will be much higher, so ideally you want to keep it as full as possible. But how do you do that? Well, also for this burst playstyle there's a special trick, because if you don't press the skill button, but rather hold it, you enter a special state where your skill state doesn't get activated, but you still consume all the Void Rifts on the field, refilling your energy before you cast the burst. So this playstyle works as follows. When there are Void Rifts on the field, hold your skill button to consume all of them and get a lot of burst energy. Then cast the burst and see everything around you completely evaporate. By the way, fun little tip here. If you play Skirk in Abyss, then this is specifically nice because there, your burst energy is completely full right at the start, allowing her to start off with a huge amount of front-loaded damage. But yeah, these would be her two main playstyles. Wasn't all that difficult to understand after all, was it? However, before we get into her builds and stuff, there is one more thing about her kit that I want to mention, and that is another one of her passives. And what that does is, whenever one of your Hydro team members or Cryo team members deals elemental damage with their attacks, Skirk will get a Death's Crossing stack, you can see them over their heads, and the more Death Crossing stacks she has, the more damage she will deal. This is a massive damage bonus, similar to the stacks for Neuvillette, so in order to deal the most damage possible with her, you want to make sure to have Skirk in a team that only consists out of Cryo and Hydro members. That's, by the way, also why in the intro I said that freeze reactions will be the most prominent ones with her. And finally, her utility passive further plays into that by saying if you only have Cryo and Hydro team members, then the level of the elemental skill for the entire team is increased by 1, which is a nice little tidbit. But now that we know and understand her entire kit, let's finally talk about the reason why you probably clicked on this video, that being her whole build, starting out with her artifact set options. First off, one thing that should come to absolutely nobody's surprise would be that, of course, her best in slot artifact is her dedicated one, the Finale of the Deep Galleries, giving you 15% more cryo damage on the 2Ps, and the 4Ps is quite a long text to say something very simple. If your character has 0 elemental energy, or in other words, Skirk is the only character in the game who can benefit from that, normal attack damage and elemental burst damage is both increased by a whopping 60%. However, it also says that if you deal normal attack damage, then the burst damage portion will be deactivated for a bit, and if you deal burst damage, the normal attack damage portion will be deactivated for a bit. So, long story short, this says you have to pick one playstyle for her, either the normal attack one or the burst one. You can't do a bit of both. So yeah, this would be her best in slot artifact set, but of course the problem is that this is specifically only usable for her, and therefore it is very resin inefficient to actually go and farm for it. Meaning a good alternative here would also be Marechaussee Hunter if you play Skirk with Furina in the same team. You know, a whole lot of crit is always awesome. Or if you specifically want to go for her normal attack playstyle, you could also get away with the Gladiator's Finale set. It is around about 10% less damage than you would get with the Finale of the Deep one, but therefore basically every player out there has a ton of Gladiator pieces in their inventory from all the bosses that we farm, meaning you're probably gonna have some pretty beefy ones here. Oh yeah, and one more thing I should mention here, if for whatever reason you're not playing Skirk with Furina, therefore you can't use the Marechaussee Hunter set, an alternative option that pretty much does the same thing would be the Blizzard Strayer set, giving you up to 40% crit rate on frozen enemies. However, in my personal opinion, if you have Furina on the team, I would rather go for Marechaussee Hunter because it's more consistent, since against bosses or special enemies, you can't freeze them at all, meaning the Blizzard Strayer set wouldn't fully work. As for which stats you're looking for on your artifact set, this is luckily very straightforward. Go for a crit circlet, either crit rate or crit damage, whatever makes more sense in your personal situation to reach the 2-to-1 ratio that you're ideally aiming for. The goblet, have it cryo damage bonus, but you could also use an attack percent goblet if the substats are better. The difference here isn't all too amazing. And for the sands, of course, go for attack percent. As for the substats, also here, no surprise, crit rate, crit damage, attack percent, and definitely no energy recharge because Skirk is an energyless character, meaning every ER substat is a complete waste. So much for the artifacts, let's now talk about her weapon options. And here, the best in slot would of course be the Azure Light, her signature weapon, with a lot of attack, crit rate, and giving you a ton of attack, with even more attack being provided if the character has 0 energy, meaning this one is tailor-made for just Skirk herself and is only somewhat of a meh stat stick on other characters. If you ask me, as long as you're not the most die-hard Skirk fan in the world, I wouldn't necessarily pull for it, especially because on this weapons banner it's together with Shenhe's polearm, so just don't do it, because we also have a great number of other options. On the one hand, for example, we have the Harangapaku Futsu, giving you more normal attack bonus, more elemental damage bonus, and having a nice crit rate substat. This one would work very well on her. Same thing with the Mist Splitter Reforged, also here great stats and useful effect. As for the Battle Pass option, I would go with the Wolffang, crit rate substat, as well as elemental skill and burst damage, plus even a little bit more crit rate on elemental skills. And then finally, another good 4-star option would be the Calamity of Ishu, but then again, you really want to be protected by a shield for this one, so only use it if your team composition includes a shielder. And then, last but definitely not least, let's also talk about team options, which is probably the most important part about every character. And here, unfortunately, Skirk is relatively limited because due to how all of her passives work, it is very clear that you want to play her exclusively in a freeze team with only cryo and hydro characters present, so anything else just isn't really worth it, which unfortunately also means that she's probably not the most free-to-play friendly or versatile character. That is something you need to keep in mind with her. Her best current team is with Furina and Escoffier because both of them deal nice off-field damage, apply their elements, plus they buff the living heck out of the entire team, with the last slot being a little bit flexible. Ideally, you would go for Shenhe here to buff up the team even faster, and guess what? She's on the same banner, almost as if the company wanted to get money out of your pocket. However, if you don't have Shenhe, I would not recommend pulling her just for this very specific team here, since overall she is very niche and limited and doesn't provide a lot of value to your account. If you don't have her, just replace the last slot with any Hydro or Cryo character that makes sense here. Yelan, for example, for a bit of buffing and more off-field damage, Xingqiu for off-field damage and Hydro application, Dahlia or Layla to give yourself a shield, which would be nice for the Calamity of Ishu weapon players, and you could also go for Silali, who also provides a shield, but mainly because she's an Atlan character. That means she can trigger the scroll set, give an even more damage bonus to the team, and because she's a catalyst, she can also work with the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, giving another fat attack bonus to your Skirk, which she will like quite a bit. As you see, many Hydro and Cryo characters work. However, one thing I want to make very clear here is Skirk's damage output rises and falls with Furina and Escoffier. If you have both of these characters on your account already, then I think you can get ridiculous damage out of Skirk. If you just have one of them, you might be able to get by if your other two team options are decent, but, and this is the big but of the video, if you neither have Furina nor Escoffier on your account, then I would strongly recommend to not pull for Skirk because her damage output without these two is going to be significantly lower, to the point where I would say rather save up your primos and go for them first before jumping into Skirk prematurely. By the way, if you also need a Furina breakdown, then don't miss my god on her right here. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, travel smart.